Hi, Pop-Tarts, back for the Quarantine Read Aloud series, chapter book edition. Today, we will be finishing Lauren Tarshi's I Survived the Sinking of the Titanic, 1912, with chapters 15 and 16 and her little afterword. Hope you love it. Let's see what happens to George. Chapter 15. Those first 2 days on the Carpathia were a blur. George mostly slept on a bed of blankets and pillows on the floor of the first-class lounge. But he sensed that Phoebe and Aunt Daisy never left his side. He sometimes heard Enzo singing softly to him in Italian, his breath hot on George's cheek. He heard Aunt Daisy and Phoebe talking about Marco, whose feet were badly frozen, about the Carpathia's passengers who couldn't do enough for them all, about the hundreds and hundreds of people who didn't make it out of the water. Slowly, Georgie felt stronger. And on their last night at sea, he was able to go out onto the deck with Phoebe. They sat on a bench, wrapped in a blanket. A stewardess came over and gave them each a mug of warm milk. Phoebe looked up at the sky as she warmed her hands on her mug. "I finally saw a shooting star when I was on the lifeboat," she said. "You can guess what I wished for." George reached for her hand. Yes, of course he knew. On the bench next to them sat 2 women. Both were crying. Probably they'd lost their husbands or brothers or fathers. There hadn't been enough wishing stars for everyone that night. Phoebe said that only about 700 of them made it out of the water. Phoebe leaned in close to George. Her coat smelled like rosewater. A lady from the Carpathia had given it to her. "Have you wondered," she asked quietly, "if maybe there really was a curse?" At first, George didn't understand that Phoebe was talking about the mummy. With all that had happened, George hadn't thought about it. But now it hit him. How strange it was that the ship had collided with the iceberg at the exact moment the scar-faced man had opened the lid to Mr. Burroughs' crate. "I guess we'll never know," George said. But the next evening, as the Carpathia was closing in on the New York harbor, George and Phoebe overheard a skinny man with a beard speaking to an officer. "Before the Titanic, I was traveling in Egypt, a place called Thebes," the man said. "I explored a magnificent tomb of a royal family." Phoebe's eyes bugged out, and before George could stop her, she had marched over to the man. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Mr. Burroughs?" "Yes, I am," the man replied. Phoebe took a big breath. "Mr. Burroughs," she said, "this might sound like a very strange question, but did you bring a mummy on board the Titanic?" The man looked at Phoebe. "A mummy?" he said. "Yes," she said. "We heard it was a princess." Mr. Burroughs' eyes were tired and sad, but he smiled a little. "My princess," he said. "Yes, so there was a mummy," Phoebe exclaimed. "No, child," he said. "One should never take a mummy from a tomb. That is very bad luck. Princess was my cat. She passed away on my trip to Egypt, and so I had her wrapped so I could bring her back with me." "So the princess was a cat?" "Yes," he said sadly, "the most beautiful cat that ever lived." 3 hours later, just after 9 o'clock, the Carpathia docked in New York City in a thunderstorm. There were thousands of people waiting on the pier. But the first person George saw as they walked down the gangplank was Papa. He rushed up to George and Phoebe, grabbing them both and pulling them to him. All around them, people cried with happiness. Others just cried, their tears mixing with the pouring rain. They introduced Papa to Marco and Enzo, but there wasn't much time to talk. Their train to Millerstown was leaving soon, and an ambulance was waiting to take Marco to the hospital. Luckily, George didn't have to say a real goodbye to Marco and Enzo. Aunt Daisy was staying in New York City to take care of Enzo until Marco's feet were healed, and then they would come with her for a visit to Millerstown. Seeing the way Marco and Aunt Daisy were looking at each other, George wondered if maybe Marco and Enzo would stay forever. George sure hoped so. As they rode to the train station, newsboys screamed from every street corner, "Read all about it! Titanic survivors in New York! More than 1,500 people dead! Read all about it!" George covered his ears. He wanted to forget everything about the Titanic. He wanted to put it out of his mind forever. Chapter 16. But he couldn't forget. Even back on the farm, surrounded by friends from school and neighbors from town, he felt like he was still drifting on the dark ocean. And each day that went by, he felt himself drifting farther away. At night, when he got into bed, he'd see the faces of all those scared people on G-deck. He'd see the ship disappearing into the sea. He'd remember the stabbing cold and the screams of hundreds of people crying for help. He didn't bother trying to fall asleep each night. After Phoebe and Papa were in bed, he went out into the woods. He was heading back to the house one night when he heard a noise through the bushes. Something was there. He could sense it. The panther? He took out his knife, fighting the urge to run away, and peered through the branches. George stared in shock. It was Papa. He was sitting on a large rock looking up at the sky, smoking his pipe. He looked like he'd been there for some time. Papa turned. He didn't look especially surprised to see George. Sorry to give you a scare, he said. What are you doing here? George asked. Don't know, Papa said. Sometimes I just come here when I can't sleep. George couldn't believe it. How many nights had they both been out in the woods at the same time? Papa eased himself off the rock and began walking back toward the house. I'll take you up to your bed. No, Papa, George said. I come to the woods too. Papa looked at him with a very slight smile. I know that, he said. Papa knew. What else did Papa know about George? Well, what else didn't George know about Papa? He and his father looked at each other, really looked, for the first time in a long while, maybe since Mama died. Suddenly, George started to cry. They took him by surprise. His tears, and he couldn't stop. He cried for all those people who didn't make it out of the water. He cried because somehow he did. He cried because he knew that no matter how much time went by, a part of him would still be out in that ocean. He would never forget. Papa held George's hand and didn't say a word. And then he led George over to the boulder where they sat together under the stars. George stared up at the sky. Were those really the same stars that had burned so brightly above the black ocean that night? Was he really still the same boy? George, who couldn't stay out of trouble. George, who didn't try hard at school. George, who found the escape ladders. George, who pulled Marco to that lifeboat. Who didn't give up. They sat on the boulder for a long while, and as the sun started to peep over the trees, George told Papa about Mr. Andrews. He said he thought one day I'd build a ship. Papa didn't laugh. He puffed on his pipe, looking thoughtful. How about we build one together, Papa said. A nice little boat for the pond. I've always wanted to do that. That's a good idea, George said. A great idea. We could start today, Papa said, standing and holding out his hand. They walked back to the house together. The birds were singing softly. The chickens were squawking for breakfast. A breeze was whispering through the trees, and a voice seemed to sing to George very softly. Awake, awake, it's now daybreak, but don't forget your dreams. Papa looked out in the woods like he could hear it too. The end. My Titanic Story. This book is a work of historical fiction. That means that all of the facts about the Titanic are true, but the main characters came from my imagination. George, Phoebe, Aunt Daisy, Marco, and Enzo are based on people I learned about while researching the Titanic. By the time I finished writing this book, they sure felt real to me. I can see George now relaxing in the little boat he and Papa built, rowing around their pond while Phoebe watches from the shore, reading a book about dinosaur fossils. I can picture Aunt Daisy and Marco's wedding, how Enzo would run down the aisle with a huge grin on his face. That's my favorite part of being a writer, giving my characters happiness in the end. If only I could do the same for the 1,517 people who didn't survive the sinking of the Titanic. What a sad and terrible story. One day I was trying to finish the book. I needed a break, so I went to New York City with my 11-year-old son Dylan. We stopped to rest in one of my favorite neighborhoods in a tiny park on West 106th Street and Broadway, with trees and a bronze statue of a woman lying on her side. I read the gold writing engraved on a marble bench, and to my surprise, I saw that the entire park was a memorial to two famous New Yorkers who died on the Titanic, Isidore and Ida Strauss. I couldn't forget the Titanic, it seemed, not even for an afternoon. And nearly 100 years later, the world hasn't forgotten either. Lauren Tarshy. Facts about the Titanic. More has been written about the Titanic than any other disaster in modern history. I tried to include as much information as I could in the book, but here are some more amazing facts that I wanted to share with you. The Titanic was the largest ship, the largest moving object ever built. It weighed close to 50,000 tons and was 11 stories tall and 4 city blocks long. There were 2,229 people on board, 1,316 passengers, and 913 crew. Survivors included 498 passengers and 215 members of the crew. The passengers came from 28 different countries, including many from America, England, Ireland, and Finland. There were a few passengers from China, Japan, Mexico, and South Africa. Most of the crew members were from England and Ireland. There were 9 dogs on the Titanic. They stayed in kennels, but their owners could take them out into the decks for walks. 2 Pomeranians, 1 Pekingese survived with their masters. After the sinking of the Titanic, laws were changed to require all ships to carry enough lifeboats for every passenger and crew member. For decades, divers, scientists, and treasure hunters searched for the wreck of the Titanic. It was finally located in 1985 by a team led by U.S. scientist Robert Ballard, 2.5 miles below the surface of the sea. Ballard and his team did not take anything from the wreck. Dr. Ballard believes the Titanic should rest in peace as a memorial to those who died. But he couldn't stop treasure hunters from diving to the wreck and removing thousands of artifacts, jewelry, dishes, clothes, even the ship's hull. What do you think about this? Do you think the Titanic should be brought to the surface or left in peace? Leave your comments below. Have a great day, and we'll see you soon.